Morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Boricua BC2 show. I'm your host, Bill Cancel. Today is going to be another fantastic show. I can feel it already. We have a fantastic guest today, Mr. Garrett Common, the Executive Director of Transparency International in the United States. Garrett has spent decades fighting for corruption, exposing dark money, and holding the powerful accountable, both here at home and around the world. Say hello, Gary. Hi, everybody.
Hello, hello.
Gary, when I saw your name come on the list to be on the show, obviously I do my research and so on. And I kind of felt like this show was specifically meant just for today with everything that's going on in the world, right? I couldn't have asked for a better guest to come on to talk about these things. So, with your experience in illicit finance and promoting anti-corruption policies, are we better now as a country or are we worse off as a country?
It's an interesting question. I mean, I think we have made some great strides in the last 20 or 30 years in terms of policy. We have put in place a number of guardrails that I think have allowed us to identify, in some cases prevent, but certainly go after and hold accountable bad actors who are moving money through the United States.
Right.
At the same time, I think we are seeing a number of developments in the world, none the least of which is more sophistication amongst criminal and corrupt actors,
Right.
right?
Right.
And so keeping up with modern finance is difficult. And so people may not necessarily feel like there's been progress made, but I think the biggest development besides the sort of, specifics of any individual policy is a wider recognition that really these financial networks are the lifeblood of criminal and corrupt networks, and that's where we need to start focusing our attention. And so that's where the fight is headed in the direction. I think that is at least a positive recognition and understanding.
Gary, could you just hang on a second? Because I'm having a technical issue that I just need to stop real quick.
Yeah, sure.
Give me 1 second. Okay, thank you. I had Apple Music playing in the background while you were talking, which is just okay. I'm back. Can you hear me, Gary?
I
Okay, great.
can.
Okay, great. Thanks. Sorry about that. I had Apple Music playing in the background for some bizarre reason. Okay, so um, yeah, Frank Vogel was on the show a couple of weeks ago. My God, what a brilliant man he is. And that show really scared the crap out of me, to be honest with you, because some of his revelations and so on. And we talked after the show, and I want to get your take on this. I'm not an economist. Definitely don't have anywhere near the experience that you have in illicit financing and corruption, so on and so forth. I'm just the average Joe American. And I have a really big concern, and I think my followers do too, that whenever we say the word corruption, especially corruption in the government, we see we see this amorphous mass, right? This blob, right? And we know it affects us, but we don't understand quite fully how I hate to say this word, trickles down to us. How do we not rationalize it, how do we chunk corruption apart so that people could better understand how it's impacting their lives? How do we do that with illicit finance? How do we do that with corruption?
No, that is actually a great question. All right. I think oftentimes people see when they think about corruption, they think, oh, somebody paid a bribe to get a contract, and that's unfortunate, and people should act ethically, but it's a financial transaction that doesn't impact my life.
Right.
Um, and I think it's on us, the anti-corruption activists and advocates need to better communicate what those harms are. And so it's wide ranging, right? So it's everything from a bribe paid to a building inspector in Miami led to the crash of that building, right? It,
Right.
it
Right. Yeah.
collapsed,
Exactly. Yeah. Right.
right? And it, killed dozens of people and destroyed homes. And this was not, some, uh, yeah, how do I want to say this? There were $1 million condos in that building, right?
Right.
So,
Right. Right.
it is. it is affecting people across the economic and political spectrum. But you also see issues around corruption. Take, for example, disaster relief. There's an interesting comparison study done by the US government after looking at money that went to help clean up after Hurricane Katrina versus that which went to help after Hurricane Sandy. No, virtually no, or very limited anti-corruption, anti-fraud measures were included in the money that was sent to clean up Hurricane Katrina. In Hurricane Sandy, there were very strict accountability, transparency, and anti-corruption measures.
Right.
Somewhere between 10 and 23% of the money that went to clean up Katrina was lost to fraud, waste, abuse, corruption, what have you. 2.7% was lost in Sandy. When you're talking about billions of dollars, that's a lot of people's lives.
Yeah,
There are
yeah.
still communities 20 years later after Katrina that are
Right.
still, feeling the impacts of that storm. In Sandy, not all those neighborhoods are, thriving, but it has nothing to do with the after effects of the hurricane because the money was spent to actually rebuild those communities. So there's real harms here. We can also talk about the national security impacts. Let me say one other thing and then I'll stop. But one
Yeah.
of the things I think that really people should be concerned about is, we talk about the fentanyl crisis and the drug crisis and the opioid
Yeah,
crisis.
sure.
And, there are agents that are stopping drugs at the border and trying to do the best they can. The drug cartels make this stuff for pennies and they sell
Right.
it for dollars. They build into their business models that a bunch of this stuff could be lost.
Right.
It's about the money. And what we should be focusing on is the illicit networks that allow and the secrecy that allows that money to flow from the United States back to the drug cartels in Latin America or wherever. And so when you start talking about corrupt, illicit finance, corrupting criminal money, you're talking about things that are literally killing people, and we need to do a better job of explaining that.
Just 2 points to add to that,
If I can, sir. On a personal level, when you talked about the delays of the hurricane allocation of funds and so on and so forth, my family's from Puerto Rico. They still haven't gotten over Maria. And Maria's 8 years now, and they're still struggling to get through that. The other thing, too, Gary, I want to really pick your brain on this one. Everything you just said, this is another thing that I'm feeling on the show, and I'm feeling this as my guest when it comes to fighting for democracy at this point in time.
so I have a 40-year plus IT background. In the last 15 years of my life, I shifted to cybersecurity. I became a cybersecurity professional. This very meticulous way of doing things in IT in cybersecurity. You just don't throw spaghetti at a wall and hope it works, right? You have to really carefully plan it, implement it, so on and so forth. What I'm seeing now, and maybe you could address this, is that how do we get these actions that you just said and divide them up in the country
in layers? So, like 60 and above, you need to understand this, you need to do this. 40 to 50, you need to understand you need to do this, and 20 to 40, you need to understand you need to do this. Because I really think that division would be much more powerful, because a 30-year-old may not understand corruption or the impact of financial corruption as well as a 60-year-old.
And vice versa. So what do you think about
it? I guess I'm struggling a little bit with the question, thinking about different ways in which different agencies are going to.
So if you had to come up with a project plan today to say we're going to fight corruption, financial corruption, right? But the only caveat that I gave you is that you had to segment that by age group. So 50 to 60 would do these tasks, 30 to 40 would do these tasks, 20 to 40 would do these tasks. What would those tasks kind of look like to understand this whole corruption thing? Does that make sense?
I guess the way I would think about it would be a little bit different. I mean, when we're talking about fraud, let's say, consumer fraud in various amongst consumers and various constituencies, I think that is an interesting and good question about how do we provide people with the tools in different age groups and different levels of understanding and relationships with technology to protect themselves against these scams. Um, I suppose what I'm talking about at the back end is the moving of the money, right? So once somebody texts you or lures somebody in with some phishing emails or what have you, and the scam is done, what gives them impunity and what allows them to keep the money and what makes it profitable is they're then able to take that money and move it. It's illicit money. And so
Right.
they have to then move it through various vehicles to launder it and move it back to wherever they may be, which could be in the United States, but could also be, overseas. And those are the types of changes that we need to see and the types of developments. And so U.S. banks have a series of anti-money laundering checks that they are required to do to know who they're doing business with, to know who the actual owners of businesses. What most people don't know is you can set up a business in the United States anonymously. You don't
Yeah.
actually have to name the owner.
That's right.
Now, the reason that most people don't even think about it is because most small business owners would never think about it. Like, Joe's Pizza is not trying to hide who owns Joe's Pizza. It's Joe,
Right.
and he's proud of it. And most small business owners are proud of their businesses. The illegal guys and the corrupt guys do try and hide their identity, and that allows them, right, to move money using those secret entities. And if law enforcement tries to track it down, they'll hit a brick wall, right? They can even go to the person that created the entity on the bad guy's behalf, and that person can legitimately say, I have no idea. I got an email and they asked me to set up a company, and I just set it up for them and I sent them the information. So we need to make sure that there's a certain level of transparency that leads to accountability for these folks, and making sure that the gatekeepers to the financial system, whether that be banks or lawyers or accountants or other corporate service providers, are making sure that they're not enabling the kinds of financial crimes that currently they're able to do, not because they want to be criminals, but they don't have
Right.
to ask the question, and therefore they don't.
Yeah.
You just it's almost as if you stole my script because you actually just led me into the next two questions. So thank you very much for that. How vulnerable, really, Gary, are we at the United States living from foreign money? How vulnerable are we? I mean, specifically from Russia and China. How entangled is this web of foreign corruption?
We're extremely vulnerable. In
Yeah.
fact, the previous Secretary of the Treasury said on multiple occasions that there is an argument that the US right now is, in fact, the easiest place in the world to hide and launder money. And let me give you one sort of telling example, right? So years ago, we put sanctions on the Iranian government
Right.
for
Yeah.
engaging in terrorist activity or funding and
Mhm.
supporting, right? There are sanctions on the Iranian government. Think about this. They, using anonymous companies and the financial structures and the secrecy that we afford, bought property on Fifth Avenue in New York. Now, the safest place on the planet for Iran to evade our sanctions is by putting money into New York City, right? Now, that's, terror financing, but there are numerous examples because, journalists receive leaks or tips or what have you
Sure.
that we know that, you know, uh, Chinese interests have set up companies and tried to access critical infrastructure here,
Right.
technology.
Right.
We know that, as I said, drug cartels are engaged here. We know that, look at how hard it was for us we put sanctions on Russian oligarchs to try and put pressure to end the Ukraine war. And we had a very difficult time finding that money, in large part because some of it was open and they invested openly, but they hedged their bets, and a bunch of that money was put through, secret structures. And so we can't enforce sanctions, crack down on drug cartels, really make sure that we are doing all we can to counter terrorism, all the things, both national security and community safety, as well as your basic, anti-fraud campaigns, unless we're able to track this money that the criminals live
Which
on.
goes right into my very next question. It's funny because being a cybersecurity professional, it's tough, right? Because when somebody hacks you, there's so many cookie crumbs you have to follow before you finally get to a source, right? And sometimes you get there, sometimes you don't get there, right? So how difficult is this to trace this money? Is it really just, I mean, on a scale of 1 to 10, with 1 being no way you're going to get it, to 10 saying, yeah, we can get it, where are we?
Yeah, well, so let me break that down, because also I think that's a fair question, right? And the issue, I think, is, you know, uh, can we track this money? Is it possible, or is it just impossible and we can't do it? And the answer to that is yes, we can, right?
Hmm.
Will we be perfect? The answer is no. But think about it this way. Um, if we were to effectively and robustly enforce our transparency laws, so this is require people to name when they set up a business who is the ultimate, what we call beneficial owner, who's the person that's actually controlling and running the
Yeah.
thing and benefiting from the proceeds of the company. Do we have, in the real estate sector, the private investment sector, the different ways that money moves around this economy in a big way, right? I'm not talking about, if you buy a pack of gum at CVS, but,
Right.
major investments, major movements of money. Do we have people in those professions that are responsible to know who their customers are so that they're not providing financial services to people they shouldn't be providing? We can do that. In fact, we've set up some of these structures. We need to finalize them. We need to enforce them. There's been, some back and forth. We can go into the details. I don't know that people care, but so yes, there are structures that we can put in place. What we always hear though is, well, give me a break, right? The head of some, Colombian drug cartel is not going to put his name on the paper,
Right.
right? So
Of course.
they're going to lie.
Yeah.
Well, here's the thing is they hire agents to do this. They hire lawyers, they hire corporate service providers. Right now, because no one has to ask the question, and there have been sort of exposés on this, that any lawyer in America, if somebody calls up and says, look, I work for somebody, he doesn't want his name on the paper, just set it up the company and then send me the information, can do that legally. And so they do. And they often get paid to then manage money that flows through that company without ever being involved in technically in criminal activity. If we put these laws in place and say, no, 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 you actually have to check, you have to ask the question, you have to know who you're dealing with, then everything changes because you then narrow it down to what law enforcement tells us are quote unquote the mob lawyers. That doesn't mean they're all working for the mob. It's just sort of their slang for these are guys that they know who they're working for. They're part of the bad guy network and they're right. Those people know who they're working for, and that's the thread that law enforcement could pick up and pull. But right now, without this basic set of requirements, everybody all the corporate service providers are willing and able to do this without asking the question, and then there really is no trail. So yes, I do think that there are significant things we can do to hold these folks accountable and begin to cut off the finances that fuel these corrupt networks.
So Gary, we know obviously next year the midterms are coming up, right? And it's going to be a big time in the country. What should we, as the average Americans, be pushing our congressional leaders or Senate leaders to be doing to reel this in? Because this is definitely bigger than a bread box.
Yeah. I mean, look, I think the answer is not that complicated for people to understand. The specifics of the policy, no one needs to get into. No one needs to be, we
Right.
don't need everybody to be a policy expert.
Okay.
But what we need people to understand and what people to start calling for is rather than these grand gestures of, sending a bunch of cops somewhere or, standing in front of a big drug bust on the border, which is great, but
Yeah, of course.
it's the cost of doing business.
Right.
All people need to say is if you're actually serious about protecting the American people, you need to follow the money. You need to follow the dirty money. That's it. If we actually had laws in place to follow the dirty money and we could cut off the money, that's what's keeping these things afloat. So I would just say, let's come up with some bumper sticker or campaign or
Yeah.
whatever that goes, follow the dirty money. And that should then lead to policy solutions that can actually have a real impact.
Okay, I have to ask the $64,000 question because you just triggered it, so I have to ask it.
Yeah.
Gary, I agree with what you just said, but what happens if the people who are responsible for enacting those laws are in fact part of the corruption?
So, I believe that we have, and be interesting, the feedback you get off of this next comment, but I believe our democratic institutions ultimately will hold.
Yeah,
Um,
I do too. I do too.
and I do believe that, yeah, we are facing some challenges.
Right.
The partisanship itself presents, good policy for moving forward because everybody looks at everything through a partisan lens and who came up with the idea first rather than whether or not it's good policy, let alone other challenges that people will no doubt raise. But I ultimately believe that our democratic institutions will hold, and that's what we need to support and count on.
I totally agree. Thank you for that, Gary. Um, Again, coming up to the midterms, just keep this in mind. What strategy do you think would help the Democrats win the midterms? Would it be financial transparency, fighting corruption, following the money, those kinds of things that we talked about? Or is it just going to be the culture wars again?
I am actually not, we're a nonpartisan organization, and I am
Right,
not
right.
uh, I'm also not I mean, we do a lot of strategy to move forward and advocate for
Right.
anti measures, but we believe that this is an issue that should cross party lines.
I totally agree. Totally agree.
And so I'm a
You can
little,
you can refrain from answering. It's
yeah,
totally
I'm a little reluctant to sort of give Democrats
No, no,
advice.
no, no, totally. That is totally fair and respectable, sir. I wasn't aware of it. Thank you very much for that.
Yeah.
So we've got two more questions left. One of them is a funny question. But what keeps you up at night, Gary? What's your biggest concern right now?
I think that one of the things that has been sort of in my mind misreported a bit is when we talk about the disengaging from the world,
right.
The cutting of foreign aid, the rethinking how we deal with multilateral institutions, as if the U.S. can somehow separate itself from the rest of the world. I think it's dangerous and worrisome on two levels. One is uh, literally the rise of autocrats and dangerous individuals around the world, which are going to present serious threats in regional conflicts and hopefully not globally, but we worry about changing alliances and where there are global threats emerging. So the emergence of bad actors starting to control larger portions of the world, and the underappreciation of the US role in that stability and how that stability not only, we're not just talking about if, there's conflicts overseas that Americans are not going to die in directly,
Yeah, of course, of course.
but it does impact economic stability. It impacts, as I said, we have it's a global world. It's a global economy. It's a right. And so if we want to address the opioid crisis, if we right, there are things
Yeah.
that we need a rule of law world. And over the last, number of years, probably since World War II, uh, there's been struggles and steps forward and steps backwards, but we have moved forward, increasing democracy and having more sort of accountable partners that we can reliably work with, that lifts up all boats, including here in the United States. And the stepping back is worries me that we are going to be on a downward spiral globally, and how that impacts the United States is going to be there's going to be a pretty serious impact, I believe, unless we turn this around.
Quickly, too. I might add, quickly. Gary, okay, this is my last question, and this is a fun question. Some of my guests like this question, some of my guests hate this question, but I just like to ask it. You don't have to answer it, so throw the doors out there. What's your predictions for the next 6 to 12 months in the country?
Wow.
That's the response I get a lot.
You know, I I do I'm not being naive and dismissing some of the very, very serious challenges that we are going through right now, and I worry a lot about that. Global stuff, I think, really is going to be telling, but I do believe that there is going to be a pathway forward. And I am, I think there's going to be more pain before we get to the other side.
I would
So
say that.
let me just say that. So I don't know if it's 6 or 12 months or
Right.
it's going to be, several years. But as I say, I think that we're going to have to experience some pain, but at some point, the American people are going to go, yeah, this is not
Yeah.
what I was hoping for, and we need to sort of rethink this. And both parties are going to start thinking about their political futures and go, you know what, let's turn this around.
I
So
totally agree.
I am hopeful in the long run. I just don't know how long that's going to take to get there.
Yeah, words right out of my mouth. Gary, thank you so much for joining the show today. Please stay around. I'll see you back in the green room in a second. To the fans in the audience of the Veruca BC2 show, I hope you found this show compelling as I did. I think Gary's a fantastic guest. We do hope to see you again, Gary. Take care, everybody. Have a great day, all.